Good morning, afternoon, evening, or wherever you're tuning in from. A very warm welcome to you all. You're here with the Diocese of Parramatta. My name is Donny Velasco and I work in the Mission Enhancement team within the Diocese, also known as MET. And today we're joined by a very special guest, one of the Diocese's very own Brother Mark O'Connor. If you haven't met Brother Mark before, he is the Vicar for Communications in the Diocese. He is also the Pope Francis Fellow at Newman College, University of Melbourne, and he is also a Mars brother from the Star of the Sea province. And for many years now, he's been the diocese's official communications representative to the Vatican. It's a joy to have you here in the space, Brother Mark.
Hi, Donny. Good to be here.
No, good to see you.
Yeah,
good to see you live and well. Where did we catch you and what time is it?
it's 7 a.m. in the morning of Tuesday, the 6th of May. So the day will unfold. The Cardinals will meet for at least two more congregation meetings. And then tomorrow they will have the Mass for the election of the Roman Pontiff in St. Peter's Cathedral, where Cardinal Ray will preach. Then there'll be a solemn procession to the Sistine Chapel. They will take their oaths before the scene of the Last Judgment, proclaiming that before Christ and their own judgment, they will choose according to their conscience, according to the Holy Spirit as it's leading them, for the best person to lead the Church at the moment. So, these moments don't come along all that often. John Paul II was for 25 years. Benedict was for 10 years. Francis was 12. So we'll see what happens. But it's a tense time for here in Rome. There's certainly a great atmosphere, but also a great, sort of anxiety and hope and anticipation.
Much going on there, I can imagine, in this period of transition. In one of your letters that you've written so far regarding this conclave coming up, you mentioned the question that was posed, how is your heart? And I just wanted to pose that to you, Brother Mark. How is your heart feeling in the midst of all this transition?
Well, it's been, I came over here just before Easter to see some future potential overseas speakers in Germany and here in Rome. In fact, I spent an hour with Cardinal Robert Prevost, the head of the Dicastery for Bishops, an Augustinian, inviting him. We'll see what happens. He's actually one of the, I'll talk about that in a few minutes. He's one of the people they talk about. Who knows? But my heart, is, of course I was very sad when the news came through. I'd actually left Rome and I was in Lyon. Just got off a plane in Lyon to come back to Australia via Lyon, where the Marish brothers were founded, to go to our general house there. And immediately when I turned on my phone, the news came through. Literally, I was on the plane that the Pope had died. I'd been at Fiumicino Airport at 6 a.m. The Pope had a stroke around 5:30 a.m. and died, I think, around 6:30 a.m. or something like that. And so literally I was there at the airport when he died, and then I flew to France, and then I didn't come straight back. I waited a day and then came back to report. So and then the funeral. The funeral was a sort of a bittersweet moment. It was very packed, huge crowds. You couldn't move like sardines. But there was a feeling also of joy as well, because so many hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, just trying to get in, as it took hours to get in, to stand in the queue to see his body laying in state in St. Peter's in a very simple coffin, and with those shoes that were orthopedic shoes that were battered and not the papal regal shoes that they normally wear, and then the 250,000 people who were in the square and nearby on the Saturday, and then the 150,000 people who lined the streets of Rome as his coffin in a converted Popemobile was taken through the streets from St. Peter's to St. Mary Major's Basilica, where he now rests. There are a few tears, but there was basically a lot of joy about what he had done for the Church and what he had done for humanity with all of his great overseas visits. I was, very impressed by the fact when one of our brothers from East Timor told me that on the day of the funeral, there were 250,000 people in St. Peter's Square from all around the world and the world's leaders. But in Dili, there was a mass held at the same time as his funeral in Rome, and 300,000 East Timorese people came. 300,000. So it shows you the impact, especially on those people who are often forgotten, like the people in East Timor who've been through great stress and anxiety and war, and are still struggling in a way to develop. So he was the Pope of the people, a Pope who stood for the climate, who stood for the poor, and who stood for just being a good human being. So I think it's a memorable time.
Yeah, and just from your response, so many snapshots of powerful moments, no less. And in the mix of all of this, there's also the formality and the logistics to get through. We've been told that you're part of one of 4,000 journalists there, and that whole registration process was in itself a bit chaotic. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Oh, well, this is the typical Roman way of organizing things, which is kind of disorganization. As they say, Romans are terrible at organization, but great at improvisation. So they improvise, and the bus is just about to go off the cliff, and you think it's a disaster, but then they veer at the last moment, and it all worked out okay. So I won't go into the saga, but I eventually got my registration, Vatican Press registration, which is here, and I'm going in each day to the Vatican Press office, and it gives me kind of first-hand contact with all sorts of people who are in contact with others. Yeah.
Among the other journalists there, what's been some of the conversations that's been going around? What's some of the energy like, Brother Mike?
Well, I think there's at the moment, it's wide open, the whole thing. I think I should say from the very beginning that it's foolish to expect, that anybody could predict who the next pope will be. It's a wide open field. We have to accept surprises, as Dom Helder Camara once said in one of his poems, and trust in the spirit. But I think, generally speaking, you may have seen one of my articles, and there are certainly some cardinals who disagreed with the direction of Pope Francis, and some of them have been quite vocal at the beginning of the general congregations. I won't mention names; they're in my article, and they kind of have a little bit of a policy. If you look at it in terms of the metaphor of driving a car, they'd like to see things reversed a bit from Pope Francis's direction. Others, I think, are very happy with Pope Francis and but think, we can't get another Pope Francis. He's absolutely unique. So the next Pope is going to have to have a slightly different style. So, they'll slightly put a brake on things, but head in the right direction. The journalists are saying the Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, an Italian, certainly has a lot of support, 30 to 40 votes, they say. This is the other journalists. I don't know whether they're accurate or not. There's a lot of gossip. And the ones you don't trust the ones you trust the least are the Italian journalists. And, they have every possible rumor and inventing things practically. And there's a few right-wing Catholic journalists from the United States who are also doing the same thing. They're making things up. But I think Parolin and some others, are more moderate, like Cardinal Prevost, whom I met with for an hour in the week before the Pope died, was the Superior General of the Augustinians. He's an American, which would normally put him, out of running because of the geopolitics of the thing. But he's not a very typical American. He spent 20 years of his life as a missionary priest and then a bishop in Peru in a poor diocese. So he's very much on the same wavelength of Pope Francis in terms of the pastoral vision. He's a lot quieter, but he's also been the Superior General of the Augustinians in Rome for several years. So he knows Rome well. He speaks several languages. He's been to Australia quite a few times. And then there's, of course, many others. And then there are others who I think would be saying, no, we've got to keep on going with Pope Francis. But and so they're in cruise control to sort of take things again at a more moderate a pace. And then you have people like Cardinal Tagle from the Philippines, who I know quite well because I hosted him in Australia in 2014. And he came to Parramatta, said a big mass at the Marist Parramatta School at the gymnasium there. Lots of Filipinos, of course, in the diocese. They'd be him. And there's another one who's emerging just in the last few days, another who's been the president of the Filipino Bishops' Conference, a man called Cardinal David. And he's been very outspoken against Duarte and human rights abuses. Apparently, he gave a very stirring speech in the pre-conclave meetings yesterday, and people are talking about him as an outsider. And then then there are the people who would be really accelerating what Pope Francis has done, and they're the Jesuit cardinals, Hollerich from Luxembourg and Cardinal Czerny, who's the head of the Justice and Peace and Ecology dicastery. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of speculation. There's endless other names, other Italians, Zuppi from Bologna, some Africans. The prospect of an Asian pope is being strongly discussed. The Italians are quite desperate to get the papacy back. They haven't had it for 45 years and they feel it's their own. They've had it for centuries. And so there is a strong feeling of that. But remember, in this conclave, there's 133 electors, and only 17 are from Italy. In the conclave in 1958, there were again 17 Italian cardinals, but there were only 54 electors in 1958. So you can see how Pope Francis and before him John Paul II have expanded the College of Cardinals to make it more global. So so there's a lot of speculation, a lot of gossip, a lot of stuff that you've got to take with a grain of salt. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and it's good that you set the expectation for our listeners that really it's end of the day we have hope and faith that's in the Holy Spirit's power that determines who is next.
I mean, I find it very hard to believe that somebody would be elected who would reverse what Pope Francis has done. But they will each have their own take on how they should take it forward. And after all, as has been said by many important people, we're not electing, and they are not electing, but we as the people of God are not electing a successor to Francis. We're electing another successor to Peter.
Yes.
And so Peter, is the figure that we follow, and Peter was, of course, a man who was headstrong and had his faults, and, and there's no pope is perfect. And so I'm sure whoever the next pope is, certain sections of the media, whether they like him or don't like him, are going to try to bring him down and bring up things and say, oh, he is. But, they did that to Pope Francis. They did that to John Paul II. They did that to Benedict. I think we can trust the spirit that, and they're, these are serious men, and they're serious. Maybe in the future there'll be women cardinals, but at the moment it's serious men. And I mean, women can't be priests, but according to church teaching, but there's no disciplinary. It's a disciplinary question about who gets made a cardinal, technically speaking. So we'll see what happens. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, one of my family friends commented that, this time of election is probably the most public in terms of social media interaction and visuals. And it's just interesting that comment just put into perspective this question about what unfolds in a conclave, because usually that's behind closed doors, so to speak, and you don't really know what's happening. But from what you know,
they've got all sorts of security for it. I mean, they're very aware of eavesdropping, of intelligence agencies trying to eavesdrop, trying to influence things. It's sort of absolutely security conscious. So when they're kind of when they're locked in, so to speak, into the Sistine Chapel, I think, because they've had several days of pre-conclave meetings, it's much more likely that the conclave will take at the most 2 or 3 days, So, they could last a lot, I mean, there'll be the first vote on the Wednesday night. Usually that just shows people where the lay of the land, etc. So that would be black smoke in St. Peter's Square on Wednesday night, May the 7th. Then there are 2 votes in the morning and 2 votes in the afternoon of the 8th of May, the Thursday. That's what happened last time, and that was when Pope Francis was elected, and that's when he came out on the second evening of the conclave. I'd say we'll have a pope by the weekend.
There you go. That's exciting to look forward to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, in some of your conversations, you mentioned you've been catching up with some Cardinal friends, and just out of interest,
I don't want to be a name dropper. I mean, the brothers in my community would, attack me for that, etc. No, I've seen a few. Obviously, I saw Cardinal Prevost, but I didn't know he was going to be in the conclave. Couple of weeks ago. Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez, whom I've hosted in Australia for the Helder Camara lecture series, come out 3 or 4 times, and he's now 82. He's not an elector, but he came for the funeral. And he didn't stay for most of the General Congregation meetings. I think he feels he's done enough. He was the head of the G9 thing for Francis and a close friend, and I think he was genuinely grieving, and his health hasn't been that great. But we had a meal together and we discussed things. Again, we were kind of saying the same things as, there's certainly a push for Cardinal Parolin. There's certainly some people who were kind of had pent up anger at the direction of the church under Pope Francis. A few of them, not many, but they were very vocal at the beginning. Most of the cardinals just sat back and listened and are praying and discerning and are pretty sensible people. Cardinal Napier from South Africa, whom I know well, is here in Rome. He's not an elector, but he's at the conclave meetings. We've had a few discussions, and I'm mixing with people like Christopher Lamb from CNN and Austin Ivory, and they are meeting with cardinals. Many cardinals. Christopher Lamb met with Cardinal Gracias from Bombay, who's a significant figure in the Asian Indian sort of scene, etc., and greatly respected. And he, believes that, certainly the next Pope will be somebody who follows in the general direction of Pope Francis. But then again, you don't know. They're, of course, not interested so much in speculating, themselves, even with other people. But I think there is a genuine desire for them to they're listening and they're praying, and most are keeping their counsel. And they're from all over the world. So it's been good. A lot of them didn't know each other. So it's been good that they've spent this week of meetings together where they've been able to listen and hear each other, and no doubt have a few private conversations discreetly. No one, of course, can promote themselves. That's absolutely verboten. You can't, that's a sort of cause for excommunication, literally, for if anybody would actually go around promoting himself. Most people are not even talking in terms of, specific names. I think they're at this point, that it'll change when they get into the conclave itself. They're talking more in terms of what are the main things the church needs now in a leader? What sort of characteristics? And many are saying, well, one of the great things about Pope Francis is that whatever you thought about some of his views on some things and that, he was a man like all of us, who had his great gifts and his faults, but he connected with people, really connect. And whoever the next Pope is, his task is going to have to be to connect with people, not just Catholics and not just other Christians, but people of other religions and other faiths, and people who are non-believers and unbelievers and half-believers, and people who are searching. And I think they're very, very conscious of the fact that at this time in the world where there are very few inspiring ethical political leaders, not that the Pope is a political leader, but he has things to say about important ethical questions, that the Catholic Church is led by a man like Pope Francis, who was able to connect with people and who can show humanity and warmth, and can show. Cardinal Caspar, in an interview yesterday, said, we need a Pope, who is close to the people, who is a Pope, a Pope who speaks the language of ordinary people. He said Pope Francis has taken the church out of the temple, he said, into the suburbs, into the streets, amongst the wounded people, the field hospital. And I think the cardinal electors are very conscious of their grave responsibility. I mean, it's a pretty frightening thing. And Cardinal Napier once said to me at his first conclave in 2005, that it's kind of an awesome, almost frightening moment when you hold when you put your hand on the Gospels and say, and then when you vote each time, they hold up the vote before they put it into the chalice on the altar of the Sistine Chapel and make this solemn vow before God, and before in terms of the penalty being their own damnation if they in any way seek to vote for somebody who they believe isn't really the choice of the Holy Spirit. So yeah, it's a pretty amazing moment, and we'll soon see in the next few days where it all goes. But accept surprises. We have to trust the Spirit.
Yeah, there's a lot of gravity in just that story you told of that cardinal and that experience of when they cast their vote. Just stepping back, in terms of your experience so far as you await this conclave, Brother Mark, what have been some memorable moments for you in the trip thus far? I remember reading in an article that a taxi driver returned your lost phone. Is there anything of that sort that has sort of stood out for you?
Well, I got stopped. Quite a distance. I thought I was going to be able to go a little bit closer to St. Peter's Square, and, I'm not the most physically fit person. I'm nearly 70, so I didn't want to walk any more than I had to. But we were stopped by security police because President Macron and his wife wanted to take a walk over the bridge. And so they closed this bridge leading to the Vatican. So we were all kind of pushed out of our vehicles, etc. And in the rush to get out, and I was a bit flummoxed. At 6:30 a.m. in the morning, I, grabbed my laptop and grabbed my coat and other things, and then I was only like literally 10 seconds out of the taxi when I realised, where's my phone? And I could see the taxi driving off. So the morning unfolded, and then I walked, at the end of the funeral from St. Peter's Square to the Piazza Venezia, which is quite a distance. And then I started feeling sick. So I was nauseous, and what happened to me is what happens to you when you get nauseous. And then eventually I recovered with the help of a nice Irish couple who were passing by, got into a taxi, eventually got back, arrived at the brother's house, walked into the reception, and I was about to explain to the receptionist that I'd lost my phone, and she held up the phone and said the taxi driver had driven right back straight after he dropped me off.
Yeah, wow.
Brought in the iPhone, which is a miracle of Pope Francis, in a way, if you know anything about Rome and taxi drivers, etc. So that was very memorable. I think seeing the Pope, with those, in the coffin, being in the square, and seeing. I wasn't that far from. I saw there was a strange-looking white man, tall man with kind of blonde white hair. It took me a while to realise it was Julian Assange.
Interesting.
Who was there with his wife and children.
Yeah, right.
Because the Pope had spoken up and asking for justice for him. Not that he's, I'm a great fan of Julian Assange. I think he's a very complicated man, and did some bad things also. But he deserved human dignity and compassion. So that was interesting. And then, of course, the crowds clapping as the Pope, his coffin, went by in the streets of Rome. And there are billboards all around Rome, Pope Francis, thank you, in Italian. And so I think there is a feeling of love and affection for him. And now, anticipation. What next?
That's it. And so I wanted to end with one final question then, irrespective of outcome, and you've touched on this already, but irrespective of outcome, Brother Mark, what is your hope for the Church and God's mission with and for the world at large?
Well, not that I think it's particularly realistic, and in many ways it's just a film, that sort of makes a few things up, in a sort of a dramatic way, melodramatic way, the conclave, the conclave film. But there is a line when the Mexican cardinal is giving a speech to the other cardinals when they've just had an incident and where they've been partially sort of injured and in a bombing, which takes place in the Sistine Chapel or nearby. And, he at one point says, the Church is what we do next. Okay. So what we do next in the Church is to follow Peter. And I think we've been given inspiring leadership by all the popes we've had in this century. Every pope, last century as well, obviously. All the popes we've had, particularly, since the Second Vatican Council, before it, John the 23rd, Pius the 12th in his own way, John the 20th. These are the popes that I've had in my lifetime. Pius the 12th, born in 55, so Pius the 12th, John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, John Paul the first, John Paul the second, Benedict and Francis. All of them have had great gifts and have led the church in remarkable ways. They weren't perfect, and the next pope won't be perfect either. People complain about him soon enough, but he is, as one American bishop once said to me when I told him, and other people were telling him how wonderful he was as a visiting speaker, he said, "Mark," he said, "never forget, nobody is more popular than a bishop outside his own diocese." Okay. So, I don't expect any magic wand, but I think we can trust in the Spirit that walking in the footsteps of Jesus, because after all, we shouldn't, sort of exaggerate the papacy. Jesus is the real head of the church. It's not a personality cult. And we've been given wonderful popes. They each have wonderful gifts. They have their limitations, like all of us, but we have this unshakable faith as Catholics that we believe the Holy Spirit does work through all the mess, and that we can continue to work on and walk on as pilgrims of hope. Very appropriate in a Jubilee year dedicated to hope.
Yeah, no, that's it. Well, thank you so much, Brother Mike, for taking us through some of your experiences so far as you've landed back in at the Vatican, and also for sharing a bit of your insights for what to expect in the days ahead. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. God bless, Donnie. Yeah.
Thank you.